Well, thank you very much for joining us for this virtual launch party for Legends of the Leaf. I've managed to get my husband to set up the easel specially for today with my giant version of the book. I've also got a normal size version. So thank you very much for joining us for this virtual launch party for Legends of the Leaf. I hope by now that everyone's got their copy of the book. If anyone has pledged via Unbound and hasn't got their copy of the book or has had any problems, I've spoken to a couple of people who have had problems. If that's you, then do shout and let me know and I'll help you get that resolved. But hopefully everyone's had a copy and is enjoying it. I'll just introduce who's here. So obviously I'm the author Jane Perrone, and with me I have Helen Entwistle, who illustrated the book, and Kelly Westlake, my wonderful assistant, who will be wrangling the chat box and directing questions to Helen and I at the end in a Q&A format. So we're not going to go on for hours, but it's a chance to just talk a little bit about the book, and I'm going to read a little extract from the Aspidistra chapter, and then we're going to have a Q&A where you can ask some questions. And if you don't have any questions, then Helen and I will just talk amongst ourselves. But if you do have a question, please pop it into the chat box on the right hand side. I think hopefully this Riverside is quite easy to negotiate. If you're used to Zoom, it's not that different. So first of all, let me say thank you for supporting Legends of the Leaf. This is a great moment to have this thing that I've worked really hard on be in my hands as a physical copy. I'm sure it's the same for Helen as well. And if I can just make a very small plea, if you have read the book and enjoyed it, I would be really grateful if you could go and leave a review somewhere. If you use Amazon, you don't have to have bought the book from Amazon. If you can bear to go on Amazon and leave a review, it does help with sales a lot. Nobody likes Amazon, but lots of people still buy their books there. If you really can't stand that, then do go on goodreads.com, where you can leave a review for the book also, and various other book platforms as well, where you can leave a review. It does make a difference. So I'd love to hear what you think of the book and, you know, your honest thoughts. So I wanted just to start off by talking a little bit about how this book came about. I've written 2 books. This is the second. I should have the first one somewhere at hand, but I don't. That was a book called...
Here we go.
Oh, there we go. Helen's got hers. The Allotment Keeper's Handbook. So the Allotment Keeper's Handbook came out when my daughter was a baby, like a tiny baby. And so I didn't really get to enjoy that book coming out very much because I was very sleep deprived. I didn't know what was happening. So really, this is my chance to actually enjoy publishing a book and having the whole launch experience, which is probably why I've done 2 launch parties, both physical and online. So that's my explanation for that. And also just the fact that obviously lots of people weren't in the vicinity of North London to come to the real thing, or the physical thing rather than the real thing. This is just as real. And so now the daughter, who was a baby when I wrote that first book, she's now 16, incredibly, and doing her GCSE. So it's kind of, it took me a long time to write a second book. And I think there is a metaphor here about producing a book and childbirth. I think probably it has similarities in terms of the pain involved and the joys involved, and also the fact that once you have given birth / written a book, you have to kind of get to the point where you've forgotten about the pain that you've been through before you decide to go through it again, because you know, it's a long drawn out process. But I'm delighted with my book. I'm delighted with my daughter, so it's all good. And for Helen, you also have had a bit of a this has been a theme for you as well, yeah. Helen, when you were working on the book, you were pregnant. So and now your son is, how old is your son now?
18 months. 18.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. It takes a long time to publish a book. So this is part of the reason why I'm very grateful for everyone, because everyone was very patient in waiting for the book to come out. So I wanted just to talk about what prompted me to dive back into the world of publishing a book about gardening. I loved my first book, The Allotment Keeper's Handbook, but houseplants have always been my real passion in life from a very small child. And I've got a lot of books on plants and specifically on houseplants. I don't know if you can just see the edge of my bookshelves, and I've got dozens of houseplant books from the present day and from the past. And looking at those books, the one thing I really realized is that there aren't many books about the history of houseplants and a rounded view of everything that they entail. And so a lot of books focus entirely on styling or design aspects or science. And so I wanted to do a sort of treat houseplants a bit seriously almost and say, actually, let's give them a rounded account that takes in everything, rather than just putting them down to this is how you look after it. And so Legends of the Leaf was a name. I think my son might have suggested it. He's very good at names like this. But Legends of the Leaf, yes, it is a play on the Ledge, the name of my podcast. But it just kind of fell into place. And I decided to go down the crowdfunding route during the pandemic because I got turned down by a couple of publishers, and I had a really clear vision of what I wanted the book to be, and that's what I was able to do with the publisher Unbound that I went with, because they gave me a lot of freedom. So if you don't like the cover, if you don't like the contents, I am the only person you can blame. Because it was all down to me. So I think doing the crowdfunding during the pandemic was actually a really helpful thing, because everyone was kind of locked at home. That we needed some outlet. So I think maybe that's why the book got funded, because everyone just kind of wanted to back something that seemed like there was a good outcome at the end of it. And I had incredible support. Loads of people were incredibly generous and helped to support the book by pledging, but also by offering their thoughts on social media and pushing it and telling friends about it. So I'm eternally grateful for all those people who did that, because really it wouldn't be here without them. Now, the books, the plants in the book, I have been asked about how I actually chose these. And I think the main thing I did was just think about, could I find 25 plants that were instantly recognizable around the world? You wouldn't necessarily know their name, but you'd go, oh yeah, I've seen that plant, even if you weren't a plant expert or a plant grower in any way, shape or form. And so that's how I chose the plants. Now, I'm probably going to admit that there's a couple in there that people would argue with me about, probably the strawberry saxifrage. But when I went back into the history of that plant, it's been grown as a houseplant for a super long time. It's one of the oldest houseplants that I've found. So for that reasons, I kind of allowed myself. And anyway, it's my book, so I just I just chose things that I wanted to profile and had interesting stories too. And as it turned out, some of those stories were quite dark. So if you've read the chapter about the leopard lily, Diefenbachia, you probably have had a very different perspective on that particular species. You know, we've got Nazis, we've got slavery, we've got sterilization. It's a dark, dark tale. And that was also important to me, that it wasn't just, oh, aren't houseplants great? Aren't they amazing? But also, sometimes they have been used for ill. Similarly, the stories about, there's a story in the chapter about the Diefenbachia, also about domestic violence. So it does get quite dark, but that was what the joy of the book was, delving into all this history. Now, Helen, we worked together on this book quite closely, and if people have listened to my podcast episode, you'll know that this was probably quite unusual, I think, for a way of working. But Helen, let's just talk a little bit about the process, because you had the joy of reading my lengthy emails about these different plants and lots of images and so on. How did you find the illustration job? This is a job probably quite different from working on other projects you've done.
The level of contact we had was brilliant. I felt we ironed out any issues or queries immediately. We could just back and forth every day, which we did quite a lot of the time, I think. Yeah, it was for me, if all projects could be like that, it would be great. having that level.
Well, and it was good working with you because you were just like really powering away. Obviously, you had the
Yeah,
deadline of having a
yeah.
baby. And I was thinking, gosh, I'm really glad Helen's here pushing me onwards because I'm thinking, wow, she's asking for more illustration
Hustling.
ideas. So she must be really powering
Yeah.
through.
We'll get this done. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you had an immovable deadline of
Yeah.
giving birth, right? So that really did make a difference. So I was sending you all those example illustrations, and I think what I really wanted to get across, I mean, I'm just going to open up an illustration here. What I really wanted to get across was I didn't want it to look like a botanical
Yeah.
illustration. So, for
What are you
example,
going for?
the monster, I didn't want it to look like a botanical illustration, much like the succulents behind me, because I feel like that's lovely and wonderful, but just I wanted a different style, and but I wanted it to be accurate, so I didn't want it to be too abstract. And I think hopefully we met that in the middle somewhere in terms of, you know, with the Swiss cheese plant, I wanted there to be some nice sort of aerial roots visible, just because that's what these plants actually
Yeah.
look like.
Yeah.
And I think we managed that quite well. I mean, I love the way that we've also got, even on the string of hearts, we've even got the little aerial tuber. Like you never see that in a picture of these plants, but actually they have these little weird little potato-y aerial tubers, and we've got one of those in the picture. So it's things like that that I think made it really special. What was the worst and the best one to illustrate, Helen? Any sort of like really
Well,
difficult
my favourite was the
plants?
lithops, I think. I absolutely loved researching those. I really would like to have some, but I've never seen them for sale anywhere. I'm still on a hunt to find some, but looking at pictures of those, it's a bit like a sweet shop, the amount of different colours and shapes. They're like nothing else I've ever seen. They're amazing. Yeah, lithops.
Yeah, they're really fun. They're really fun. Not the easiest thing to look after,
Oh,
unfortunately.
maybe at this point in life, it's
But
not the right plant for me.
maybe. I mean, were there any ones that were really tricky to get right?
The Swiss cheese plant was quite tricky, just to get the balance of the leaves. Just looking at that here, I think initially it didn't have enough leaves, and then I put too many in, just trying to get it looking like a natural plant. And in the end, I just drew every leaf on my plants, and then it kind of looked how I'd hoped it would have looked. So really, I should have just done that at the beginning. Yeah,
Yeah. And did you obviously I sent you illustrations and stuff. Did it really help having your own plants for some of them where you could
it
draw
did.
on
It was just
actual real life
another
examples?
another dimension of how to view the plant, and just twisting the pot around to find a good angle to draw each leaf from. It did help.
Mm,
Although, like, looking at the internet and books is handy, real life for me is where it's at with drawing. If I didn't have them here, I
yeah.
went to garden centres to find them. So I did manage to find
Yeah.
everything,
And
mostly, apart from, say, the lithops and Marimo mossball. They weren't to be found in Cumbria. However, everything else I managed to find. Yeah.
well, I haven't. My Merriman moss balls are in a jar, very much like the one in the actual picture. They're actually not in here; they're in the house. But mine are in a pickle jar. That's exactly the
Really?
container, just like in the
Yeah.
book. So they're not really very decorative at the minute. We did have them in a fish tank, but that was decommissioned at one point. So yeah, mine do look. I mean, I wish the jar looked as good as this, quite frankly. But they're tough. They are tough. So they are quite happy in there. But it was really fun to and I think this was the only one actually where this wasn't. Was this actually a pickle jar from your house? Am I
Well,
remembering that
the
right?
jar was drawn from life. I found that in the fridge. But the jar were taken from pictures. Yeah. Although my
Yeah,
sister told
yeah.
me that she has one, and I didn't know that. So
Oh, okay.
that shocked me because I didn't know she was that much into her houseplants. But she said, I have married a
There you
houseplants.
go.
Oh, right. If only I'd have known.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit in two minds about putting them in the book because obviously they're not actually a plant. But once I got into the history of them and finding out about the culture around them in Japan, I was just so fascinated that I just had to include them. And you know, but made for a good bit of variety as
Yeah.
well, I think, which was
Yeah.
good. Yeah, and I love the way that you illustrated the pots, which all apart from that pickle, well, including that pickle jar, were either pots you owned or pots
Yeah.
I owned, which was really, I think, worked really well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's personal to us, and say I'm looking at the oxalis here. That the pot that the oxalis is in came from my husband's grandma's house, so that's a special one. Yeah, there's a lot of memories tied
Yeah.
into a lot of my pots, and I'm sure there are for yours too.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I think I mentioned in the text somewhere about having I can't think which plant it was now. But having, oh, maybe it was actually the Boston fern. That's right. Said, oh well, if you're a Simpsons fan, you could have a Sideshow Bob pot and have your Boston fern in that. And lo and behold, the other day I did see a picture of somebody. It wasn't actually a Boston fern; it was an asparagus fern, the foxtail one. And I was like, somebody's taken my idea. So I think sometimes I'm sometimes a bit dismissive of like novelty pots, but then sometimes they just work
Yeah.
perfectly, and that's exactly what you need to set a plant off. Oh, well, it's really lovely to talk about the book, but I'm now just going to read a little extract. And this is from the asparagus, not the asparagus fern. The asparagus fern is not in the book. It's from the Aspidistra chapter. I think this was probably one of my favourite chapters to write, just because this plant is just so embedded in the history of the UK, and it's a plant that I've kind of been going on about for a long time as a house plant. Although I have to admit, right now, all of my aspidistras have been outside and survived the really tough winter we had. And they're doing really nicely outside. So they've had to be turfed outside because I had too many houseplants inside. And that's the beauty of the aspidistra, that they can actually survive those conditions. And there's the illustration. And this pot is one of mine. Again, it's a pot that I have had for years. I bought this in a jumble sale in the Somerset village where my parents were living at the time, and it's a sort of, I think it's probably mid-century, and I absolutely love it. It's a really, really nice pot. So again, that's really special to have that in there. So I'm just going to read the start of the Aspidistra chapter, a couple of pages, for you, in the expectation that one day maybe there'll be an audiobook of this book, but for the minute you just have to have this little extract. And if you want to hear more, I do read one of the chapters for my Patreon audience. If you're part of Patreon, you can hear a sample chapter if you're a legend or superfan level. So I'm going to read the Aspidistra elatior, not all of it, but part of this opening part of this chapter. Aspidistra elatior, cast iron plant. Readers perusing the small ads in the Times circa 1932 in search of a holiday getaway may well have come across a small advertisement for Tower House. This hotel boasted of being the warmest house in Bournemouth, a resort town on England's south coast, and mentioned its spacious lounges and bedrooms with hot and cold water, concluding with the 1930s equivalent of a mic drop: no aspidistras, in capital letters. How could a plant be so reviled that an English guest house felt obliged to assure guests of an aspidistra-free environment? The fortunes of the cast iron plant have waxed and waned dramatically since the Japanese species was first described to science in 1834 by the German-Dutch botanist and plant collector Carl Ludwig Bloom. The Dutch had exclusive trading rights with Japan, hence it was they who first introduced this plant into Europe. In 1861, the Gardener's Chronicle reported that Belgian horticulturalist Louis van Hout recommended the little-known plant for growing in sitting rooms due to its ability to survive shade and fluctuations in temperature. 30 years later, the Aspidistra topped a list of the 20 best plants for living rooms in the same publication. It spread across the Atlantic just as speedily, becoming a fixture of American parlours. and being adopted as an outdoor bedding plant in more southerly states where it could survive the winter. Some of its array of other common names, barroom plant and spittoon plant in the UK and the US, and the butcher's plant and cobbler's palm in the Netherlands and Germany, further reflect the aspidistras' ability to survive in far from ideal conditions. By 1900, no parlour in a middle-class home was complete without a cast-iron plant, a living symbol of Victorian respectability. There is a story that every aspidistra leaf symbolised £100 of a family's annual income. True or not, this was a plant that people loved to put on show, and many photographs still exist of Victorians posing alongside their aspidistras. Plants were usually nestled in a jardiniere and framed by curtains that allowed passers-by ample views of the aspidistra but kept the rest of the room obscured from view. To what can we ascribe the aspidistra's rise to Victorian houseplant ascendancy? This species has a hidden superpower, its ability to withstand the ethylene-laced air that occupied Victorian homes lit by gas and heated by coal fires. You will have harnessed the effects of ethylene if you've ever put a banana in a bag to hasten the ripening of green tomatoes. It's also the plant hormone used to initiate flowering in bromeliads, including the pineapple. But when plants were exposed to the levels of ethylene given off by Victorian-era gas lights, most would struggle, become leggy, lose leaves and flowers, and eventually die. Aspidistra elatior is able to cope with far higher ethylene levels than most other houseplants, aside from fellow Victorian favourite Howea forsteriana. It may have become such a staple because it simply survived where other plants did not. Even once gas lighting began to be replaced by electric lights in the early 20th century, the reign of the aspidistra was not over. Things started to look shaky in the 1920s when fussy, overpacked Victorian-era interiors began to be emptied and replaced with the clean lines of Art Deco. Aspidistras became a symbol of everything people wanted to forget about the previous century. In 1926, a play called Aspidistras by Joan Temple received a lukewarm reception in the Times, with the reviewer noting, "The aspidistral background, decorated lavishly with the pale paper flowers of suburban humour, has been used so often that a dramatic of some importance is needed to justify the use of it again." The aspidistra was thus well cemented as the butt of jokes by the time George Orwell's novel Keep the Aspidistra Flying was published in 1936. In this semi-autobiographical work, he poured all his contempt for a middle-class money-grabbing mentality into the aspidistra. Orwell's main character, a hard-up advertising copywriter named Gordon Comstock, finds himself renting a dingy room from a landlady who has thoughtfully provided an aspidistra in an effort to make him feel at home. Comstock does his best to kill it, failing because, of course, the beastly things are practically immortal. Later in the novel, Orwell writes, "The aspidistra, flower of England. It ought to be on our coat of arms instead of the lion and the unicorn. There will be no revolution in England while there are aspidistras in the windows." English music hall star Gracie Field's song, The Biggest Aspidistra in the World, came out 2 years later and was much more playful than Orwell's polemic. The lyrics tell of an aspidistra that gets, improbably admittedly, crossed with an oak tree and ends up so large it has to be watered by the fire brigade. The song was popular enough to be reworked in 1941 to include a line about stringing Hitler from the highest branch. The same year, Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave the name aspidistra to a powerful radio transmitter that broadcast black propaganda to the German people. The aspidistra may have officially been out of fashion, but people continue to place their plants in pride of place for decades to come. My favourite aspidistra photograph dates from 1940 and shows the aftermath of an air raid on London. 2 women stand in front of the brick skeleton of a terraced house, knee-deep in masonry, a scene of utter devastation all around. One woman holds an aspidistra in a jardiniere, while the other grasps a smaller aspidistra. perhaps a division of the first, in a terracotta pot with one hand and a mantel clock with the other. At a time when all other points of reference seemed lost, the solid, durable aspidistra remained. You couldn't even blow it up. There we go. So that the chapter goes on. There's more, but I'm not going to read any more. But I really enjoyed writing that chapter. It was so interesting, and I learned absolutely loads. And if you want to see that picture of the aspidistra, I will make sure it's up on my website for the book, legendsoftheleaf.com. legendsoftheleafbook.com, should get this right. If you go to legendsoftheleafbook.com, I will make sure that picture is linked from there if you want to go and have a look at it. It's a really amazing picture and definitely worth seeing. And also do Google that Gracie Fields song. It's quite something. It's of its era, but it really gives you an idea of just how influential that plant was. And there's actually lots of archive footage of aspidistras in different contexts. There's also a news report. There's various news reports about aspidistras over the year as well. If you maybe I'll put a set of links together for you to go and watch all these different bits of aspidistra history at legendsoftheleafbook.com. I will do that in the next couple of days for you to enjoy. So yeah, aspidistras are amazing. And that's one of the reasons why I love profiling them in the book. And I think they're starting to turn up a bit more in houseplant shops. I don't know if you, Kelly and Helen, have seen them, but I've certainly seen more going about. So perhaps I'm having a beneficial influence. I don't know, but it's about time that plant had a resurgence because it's such a good one. Now, have we got any questions coming in on the chat, Kelly? Has anyone?
Yeah. Do you want me to?
Do you want us? Let's fire. Let's fire away with some questions while I slurp my tea, Kelly. I'm gonna hope that you're gonna direct some questions to me and Helen.
Okay, so Katerina was quick off the mark with a couple of questions. Firstly, whether there was a chapter or a plant that was especially interesting during the research phase.
Well, I mean, aside from the aspidistra, which I've already talked about, that was very interesting. But I did know a lot of that before I started. I think that probably the Dieffenbachia chapter, really that I didn't know any of that stuff about the history of that plant in connection with being used for experimenting with sterilization. Very dark history, which is quite hidden as well, because obviously lots of records were destroyed after the war. So the amount of stuff I could find was quite limited, but there was enough to for me to confirm that actually happened. What we don't know is, or what I didn't manage to find out, is whether the experiments failed because they couldn't heat the glass houses enough, or whether the glass houses were actually bombed. That wasn't quite clear. I would imagine that obviously at a time when you were in a period of war, heating glass houses to the required temperature for Dieffenbachias may have meant that wasn't possible. But it's a horrific piece of history that I don't think is well known. And the other thing in that chapter that I reflected on when I was thinking about what to title it was the fact that its history as a form of punishment for slaves led to that name, that common name of Dumcane. And I decided not to title the chapter that name for that reason, because it felt like a name that had such a heavy freight of a really dark and racist and horrendous history that I felt like leopard lily was a better name, common name for the plant. And that does resonate throughout the book, where there are some names which, again, I chose not to use. For example, the snake plant on the cover here, I talk about that plant and the reasons why I don't like the name mother-in-law's tongue, because it's terribly misogynist. But again, there were choices like that I had to make. But they were all fascinating in their own way, and different things came out in every chapter. But leopard lily kind of was disturbingly interesting. I also really got a bit obsessed with the jade burial suits. that I talk about in the introduction to the Crassula ovata chapter. So if you haven't read that chapter, the opening to that chapter talks about the way that Chinese culture values the mineral jade very highly, and it has different levels of symbolism, both in terms of eternal life and value. And so I introduced that chapter by talking about the way that in the past, high profile people in that culture were buried wearing a suit entirely made of jade tiles joined together by gold wire as a way of preserving their spirit on into eternity. And so that relates then to the jade plant, because the jade plant's leaves look like jade. And that's why, although this plant comes from South Africa, it's such a symbolic plant in that culture. So that was really fascinating too. And I spent a long time learning about jade burial suits, and not much of it went in the book. So that was the case for a lot of chapters where there was a lot of stuff that I learned that I just couldn't fit in. Similarly, I spent ages looking at the fruit of the Swiss cheese plant and how that actually was used to be more widely available in the UK than it is now. But again, I just didn't have room to put a lot of stuff in the book. So some of that had to go by the wayside. But, you know, as somebody who loves researching stuff, it was just great fun. So I really hope that people find all that interesting. And, you know, sometimes when I'm opening a chapter and you're thinking, why is she going on about jade burial suits? Hopefully in the end, it all becomes clear as you read on why that's significant, and it all kind of feeds into the general narrative about those plants.
Do you want a second question from Katerina?
Yeah.
Whether there are any funny stories or happenings from the time of making the book, anything that happened during the writing?
Well, I mean, as I've said, writing a book is it was a real delight, because, as I say, I was just like doing all this amazing scouring of archives and finding out all this amazing stuff, which was great. But at the same time, you're under time pressure, knowing that there's all these people who've already paid for something that you haven't yet created. So there was a lot of pressure to get it done. And I did feel that, the weight of expectation. And, you know, I had various people, and not surprisingly, not everyone realizes how long it takes to write a book. So when I filed the manuscript, you know, some people were sort of saying, oh, will I be getting the book in a couple of weeks? And you had to sort of say, I'm really sorry, no, because it takes a long time. I do remember I had various soundtracks. So my soundtracks for writing the book were I had various songs that I put on, hype tracks that I put myself on when I needed to kind of like motivate myself. So one of those was the Star Wars theme tune. Now, I am not a Star Wars person at all, but there was something about that just used to get me motivated. And also Jealous of My Boogie by RuPaul was the other one. And there was another one. And also All Together Now by The Farm. Three very disparate tracks if you know your music, but all of those, like if I hear those now, it reminds me of this time of just like, oh my gosh, and then sending stuff to Helen and being like, she's so far ahead of me, she's done all these illustrations. So it was a real sort of sense of urgency, but at the same time I felt so passionate about making sure that the information was right, because I really hate it in plant books when people just pass on information that you can see they've just kind of gathered from a website and isn't necessarily correct. So I had to do a lot of digging to check things were correct. So yeah, I was doing it to Jealous of My Boogie.
Okay, Hannah would like to know if you will wait another 16 years before writing the next book.
Well, you know what? It may well be. I mean, a lot happened in those 16 years. Yeah. I wasn't just sitting about. I mean, I launched a podcast. I had 2 children. So, you know, but writing a book is a wonderful experience. It is a marathon. My son suggested 2 names for sequels to Legends of the Leaf, because of course there are another 25 plants and another 25 plants that I could profile quite easily. So he suggested Secrets of the Stem for book 2 and Folklore of the Flowers for book 3. So, I mean, who knows? It might happen. But, and I've always got like half a dozen ideas for books in my head. But it's quite a lot to take on, and one of the joys of making a podcast is it comes out and then you're on to the next one. It's a very different process to writing a book. So yeah, hopefully at some point, but I'm just enjoying having this book out in the world right now.
I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly. Diamond and Kylene have asked the same question effectively, which is which plants almost made the cut but aren't in the final book?
I'm just going to pull up my files here because this will actually remind me of the ones that didn't make the cut. So I originally was going to have some kind of Goepertia in the book. I think I was looking at Goepertia orbifolia, which is as was Calathea orbifolia, and I think I just ran out of steam and I didn't find enough. I mean, I'm sure there is interesting stuff out there, but at the time I just didn't find an awful lot about that particular species. I thought it would be a beautiful one to include because it's got these really big round leaves with this amazing sort of pinstripe pattern on them. I thought it'd be amazing for Helen to illustrate, and it's a really popular plant, but at the same time I didn't find enough that I just was set on fire by in the same way as other ones. I also really debated which Hoya to do, because obviously, being a Hoya fan, and there's so many amazing Hoyas out there, I was like, ooh, should I do Linearis? Shall I do Bella? But in the end, it had to be Carnosa because it is for me, the preeminent Hoya that's just been grown and loved and is still so widespread. So that made the cut in the end. Cacti, I mean, I could have gone on and on with cacti from my love of cacti, but again, I was sort of trying to find something that is iconic looking, and I thought that the bunny ears cactus really fitted that. But at one point I was looking at the golden barrel cactus, but then I thought, well, not many people actually have that as a house plant because it gets so massive. And the only other one was at one point early on in the book, and I'm really glad I didn't do this, but I was looking at Philodendron Pink Princess, and I think that would have aged really badly, because that was a plant that had this huge rush of interest, and now it's kind of died down and it's not quite so iconic as it perhaps was in 2020 when I launched the crowdfunder. So that didn't make the cut. And the only other one that I'm just trying to think if there was another one. I think I looked at I think I nearly didn't do Diefenbaker until I started really looking into it, and then I realized just how amazing it was, and that had to make the cut. And yeah, those were probably the main choices I had to make. It wasn't that hard, really. I suppose the ones that I probably look now back and think, oh gosh, why didn't I do this, is probably maybe some more flowers, like Phalaenopsis is so ubiquitous. That would have made a fascinating chapter. I can put that in folklore of the flowers, I guess. And also I guess also that I didn't do St. Paulia, the African violet, and as a Gesneriad fan, that should have probably been in there, but I didn't. So there's room for another book, but those are some of the ones that didn't make the cut. But I'm glad I didn't do Philodendron Pink Princess, because I think that, as I say, that probably would have been, people in 10 years time are going to look at it and go, well, why was that in the book? So it all worked out in the end.
Katerina also had a question for you, Helen, about whether you were a plant lover before doing the illustrations, or whether doing the illustrations made you a plant lover.
Yes, I've been a houseplant lover, well, plants in general, for an awful long time. I'll be honest and say I've got less plants now than I did have when I illustrated the book. Having had a baby, I'm going to say I've got a graveyard shelf over there with just empty pots on that 2 years ago had plants in. I'm not being neglectful. I think it's forgetful. Watering's gone out the window slightly lately. But yeah, plants have been big on my agenda for an awful long time. Me and Jane actually came to know each other through some of my products relating to plants a few years back. Seed Saver envelope. I think it was those. It was those. Yeah.
I think I've got. Hang on, I think I've got one here. Here we go. Look, I've actually got one.
You got
Look, there we
them
are.
there.
That one hasn't been used. Can you see that? But these are the beautiful Seed Saver envelopes you sent me.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think I kept
Yeah,
that one
but
as a special.
yeah. If I
Nice, it's so
If I was
good.
in my studio, I could pull out loads of illustrations and screen prints I've made of plants, but I'm in the room below because I didn't want to wake the baby by talking too loud if I was in my workshop upstairs. So I'm down here, but if I scan this way, you can see my shelf of cacti. The empty one's the graveyard down the bottom, but I've got all my cacti and succulents on that shelf over there. And I've got my
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, and I have to say, when I was choosing, I was again had a lot of control, so I was able to choose the illustrator. And really, I did look at some other illustrators, but really, it was always going to be Helen from the start. So yeah, it was a good choice. You were a really good choice, and it was just so fun to work with you. And the illustrations, I don't know about you, but these turned out exactly how I was just so
me
happy
too.
with them. They turned out exactly how I
Me
wanted
too.
them. So I'm
Yeah.
really pleased.
You've preempted Shara's question there, which was along the lines of how much control you
Cover.
had over the cover.
That's a
Yeah,
question.
just lots of
Yeah.
praise.
So
That's a good question.
yeah. So the I don't think the original. There were two iterations of the cover design. I don't think the first one included the illustrations, and I really wasn't. I asked them to redo it because I had a control freak pedant, as you see. My badge says here pedant. Yes, I wanted it to look a particular way. And I was told, it was interesting because I was told by people in publishing, well, your cover has to look like other people's covers because that's people recognize a cover and then they kind of know what it's all about. And it's not a bad thing for your cover to look like other people's covers. Now, maybe this is me being an enormous ego, but my attitude was, I want my cover to be the one that other people copy. So I had a really clear vision that I wanted it to be quite dark, and I wanted to use Helen's illustrations because why the hell wouldn't you tie into the illustrations in the book? But I have to give Unbound massive credit.
Great.
Because they took all of that on board and they did the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but I think he is, I will look this up afterwards. I think he's called, I'm just going to look this up now. I think he's called MECOB. I'm just checking this out. I'll find it afterwards anyway. But the cover designer did a brilliant job, and I was absolutely delighted with the cover. I mean, Helen, is that reflect what you think about the cover?
Absolutely. Yeah, it went through various iterations, didn't it? For me, it's just a relief that my work is included in there because the idea of it being completely separate, it was just an odd choice, and it just wouldn't have. It would have been quite disparate, wouldn't it, between the content and the cover? But no, I think the dark cover with the foil blocked title, it's brilliant. Really chuffed.
Yeah, everyone loves the foil. The foil is really popular. So, and I kind of like also the fact that I think that's
foiled spine.
I just like it anyway. Foiled spine. I've been really pleased with the cover, and I think it really reflects the book and reflects what's inside. And I'm really hoping that I see copycats, that I see books that look a little bit like this coming out in the future, because that would be really cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Jane, I have a question about if I may, about the order of the chapters. Is there any particular reason for that sequencing? And also, do you envisage it being a book that you read in a linear way from chapter 1 to the end, or can people dip in and out more randomly?
Well, I'm just checking this to see I'm not going mad, but the order is done because I'm a total geek on the basis of the genus name.
Right.
So the reason why Aigogropila linnei is first is because Aigogropila starts with A. So it's literally based on just alphabetical order from the genus name. Because, as I say, I mean, and in terms of reading it through, there is absolutely no reason why you can't dip into an individual chapter that you are particularly fascinated by. and go straight for that chapter. But also, you can read it through from the beginning, from cover to cover. It was written so that if you come across certain things more than once, the second time you come across them in the sort of the narrative of the book, you'll be referred back to the first mention. I think specifically of things like crassulacean acid metabolism, which listeners to the podcast will know I love talking about. That's mentioned a couple of times in the book, and it's explained the first time in the first chapter where it's mentioned, and then you're referred back to the first mention for the full explanation from there on in. So yeah, you can read it however you like, and I think, you know, some people might just be literally flicking to the care guide on each chapter and looking at that and not really bothering with the text, but I really hope people do read the text, because my aim was that even if you weren't interested in plants much, you would still find enough in there to read. And the harshest critic of all, my mum, who's not really into plants at all, did say, it's really interesting, Joan. I've learned loads and I'm really enjoying it. So, you know, if my mum's enjoying it, then that's good. That's good enough for me.
There's a really lovely
but yeah,
from Jane from Shadiamond. Shadiamond says that they are only allowing themselves to read a chapter a day. They're savouring it.
oh my gosh. Well, that's really good to hear, because as I say, you know, you've got a month, almost a month's worth of content in there. I mean, I think one of the things I didn't do, we didn't reach the crowdfunding level to, I think if we'd have reached 150%, it would have unlocked a reward, which was an extra chapter of the book. And I may do that at some point anyway. Maybe I'll do that at some point for somebody, maybe for my Patreon audience or something, because whenever I'm now doing research for a podcast episode, I find myself using the same research techniques that I used for the book and finding out a lot more about the plants that I'm looking at. So yeah, you never know. There might be a bonus chapter coming out at some point for somebody. Maybe one of the plants that I didn't get to do, or maybe people can suggest chapters, plants that they particularly want me to profile, that I didn't cover. I don't know if there's more. There's obviously lots more scope. There's another 50 houseplants I could have quite easily done. But yeah, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. I mean, I haven't had any negative feedback so far, and I'm quite, you know, nervously awaiting more reviews coming out of people going, oh, you know, I was disappointed because of X, Y, and Z. But so far, everyone said everything really nice things, so that's good. I guess I should just leave it there and and not delve any further into the reviews. But it's been delightful to see people's reaction.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Have we run out of questions to ask? We're getting up to 50 minutes. I'm happy to keep going on the questions unless we have run out.
I think that is it for now in the way of questions.
Excellent.
Like you say, just all praise and positivity.
Well, it's really good. It's been so great to get the book out there. It has been like it sounds really cheesy to say a dream come true. It's my dream come true, but it really is to be able to kind of unlock all this information about these plants has been a real privilege, and hopefully it kind of stands alongside the podcast as an example. I mean, I talked about this actually in my recent newsletter about the fact that oftentimes when I'm talking to other people in the gardening world about houseplants, there is a kind of almost an attitude of being a little bit patronized when you say, oh, I do houseplants are my thing. You know, people in other parts of horticulture sort of slightly look down. And so this book is really my answer to that, to say, actually, no, take houseplants seriously. Take people who grow houseplants seriously, because they are just as important a part of the horticultural world as any other kind of gardening, and deserve to be given an in-depth dive. And that's what I've done with this book. So I'm really delighted with the way it's turned out. And again, just thank you to everybody who supported. And do go and check out if you go to legendsoftheleafbook.com, you can find out more about the book. and click through to some interesting links and my longer chat with Helen on the podcast. But it's been a delight. Anything else you want to say, Helen? Any other things out we haven't chatted about? I think we've probably covered most of it, but
yeah.
Excellent. Well, it's been really fun. I'm not going to waffle on any longer, but it's been great to have the chance to have this chat. And if anyone hasn't had their questions answered or are listening to this after the fact and you want to get in touch with me, if you go to legendsoftheleafbook.com, you'll find my contact page and you can drop me a line. I'm happy to answer any questions. And do go and check out my podcast if you are not already